100. That is the number that U.S. Central Command posted on X on Saturday, May 24, 2026. 100 commercial vessels redirected during the 6-week-long naval blockade of Iran's ports, supported by more than 200 aircraft and warships, 2 carrier strike groups, multiple guided missile destroyers, 100 ships that attempted to enter or leave Iranian ports and were turned around by the most consequential naval enforcement operation the United States has conducted in the Persian Gulf since the tanker wars of the 1980s, 100 ships that represent 100 individual calculations by 100 separate shipping companies, oil traders, port operators, and cargo owners that attempting to reach an Iranian port was worth the risk of an American warship appearing on the horizon and redirecting them before they got there. 100 attempts, 100 redirections, 0 successful runs through the blockade line in either direction under American interdiction. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper said the mission has squeezed Iran economically. That sentence is the operational summary of what 100 redirected ships actually means in the specific economic arithmetic of an Iranian regime that has been losing $500 million per day since the blockade began on April 13th, 6 weeks, 42 days, at $500 million per day, that is $21 billion in accumulated economic losses from the blockade period alone, compounding on top of the broader conflict losses that began when Operation Epic Fury started on February 28th, 100 ships, $21 billion, and on the same day that CENTCOM announced the 100-ship milestone, Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that time is on our side and told his negotiating team not to rush into a deal. Read those two simultaneous communications together. The blockade just hit its 100-ship milestone and the president told his team to slow down. That is not a contradiction. In American strategy, that is American strategy operating at its maximum deliberate efficiency and understanding precisely why time is on our side and 100 ships redirected are the same strategic message delivered through 2 different channels on the same day is the only analytical lens through which the current phase of this conflict makes complete sense. But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Trump's Sunday pivot from largely negotiated on Saturday to time is on our side and don't rush on Sunday is the most strategically revealing single 24-hour communication shift this conflict has produced, and why it tells you more about where the deal's actual probability distribution stands than anything Rubio said about good news possibly coming or anything Pompeo said about paying the IRGC to build a weapons of mass destruction program. You need to understand the specific pressure architecture that 100 redirected ships and 6 weeks of $500 million daily losses have constructed, and you need to understand why that architecture is more valuable to Washington intact than it is converted into a deal whose phase to the blockade's removal would make structurally impossible to enforce. Here is what Trump actually wrote on Truth Social on Sunday. The negotiations are proceeding in an orderly and constructive manner, and I have informed my representatives not to rush into a deal and that time is on our side. The blockade will remain in full force and effect until an agreement is reached, certified, and signed. Both sides must take their time and get it right. There can be no mistakes. Read that post with the full weight every sentence carries. The blockade will remain in full force and effect until an agreement is reached, certified, and signed, not until an agreement is largely negotiated, not until ANMU is initialed, not until both sides agree on broad principles, until an agreement is reached, certified, and signed. Those 3 conditions exist in sequence. Reached means the document's text is finalized. Certified means the verification architecture that confirms Iranian compliance is operational. Signed means the institutional authority on the Iranian side whose signature constitutes a binding commitment has placed that signature on the document, all 3, in order, before the blockade lifts. Trump added that Iran must understand, however, that they cannot develop or procure a nuclear weapon or bomb. That sentence is not new. It has been the American position since February 28th, but its placement in the same post that tells negotiators not to rush and confirms the blockade stays until certified and signed is the specific sequencing communication that tells you the Saturday largely negotiated optimism and the Sunday time is on our side recalibration are not contradictory signals from a president who changed his mind overnight. They are the 2 phases of a deliberate negotiating posture whose architecture the Republican hawk pressure from Saturday evening accelerated into public visibility faster than the diplomatic track's timeline required. Now let's talk about what happened between Saturday evening's largely negotiated announcement and Sunday morning's time is on our side recalibration, because the specific sequence of events in those 18 hours is the operational record of how Republican institutional pressure, Israeli conditions, and the IRG's Sunday silence on the MOU's terms combined to produce the pivot that the Sunday Post represents. Republican hawks are openly concerned that President Donald Trump is about to settle for far less than he promised in a deal to end the Iran war. Prominent Republican senators and former Trump officials warn the deal falls short of his initial demands. The criticism has grown so intense that Trump advisors are now responding sharply to critics within their own party. Mike Pompeo said the deal being floated would pay the IRG to build a WMD program and terrorize the world. Not remotely America first, it's straightforward: open the damned strait, deny Iran access to money, take out enough Iranian capability so it cannot threaten our allies in the region. Senators Roger Wicker, Ted Cruz, and Lindsey Graham also offered criticisms. The deal appeared likely to end the U.S. blockade of Iran's ports, but did not appear as if it would include any immediate limitations on Iran's nuclear program. That last clause is the operational core of every Republican hawk objection. The blockade ends, the frozen assets unfreeze, the strait reopens, the oil sanctions lift, Iran's nuclear program survives Phase 1 intact, and Phase 2's 60-day nuclear negotiating track operates without the economic pressure that made Phase 1's concessions achievable. The White House Communications Director Stephen Chung blasted Pompeo, telling him to shut his stupid mouth. The White House telling a former Secretary of State to shut his stupid mouth in public over his criticism of an emerging Iran deal is not standard diplomatic communications management. It is the specific institutional behavior of an administration whose internal pressure from its own coalition has reached the threshold where the public response to that pressure reveals more about the deal's internal vulnerabilities than the diplomatic language being used to describe it does. You do not tell former cabinet members to shut their stupid mouths when the deal they are criticizing has no structural vulnerabilities worth defending against. You tell them to shut their stupid mouths when what they are saying is accurate enough to be operationally damaging to the negotiating posture it describes. Now, let's get into what time is on our side actually means in the specific context of the 100-ship blockade milestone. Because Trump's formulation is not rhetorical patience management directed at his own negotiating team, it is the precise operational description of a pressure dynamic whose mathematics the Iranian regime's oil ministry understands better than any diplomatic communique could communicate. The blockade has been enforcing against vessels of all nations entering or departing Iranian ports and coastal areas, including all Iranian ports on the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman since April 13, 6 weeks, 100 ships, $500 million per day. The accumulated economic pressure of that arithmetic is the specific variable that makes time on our side an analytically defensible position rather than a rhetorical one. Every day the blockade continues is a day the Iranian economic deterioration that has been running since February 28 compounds further. Every ship redirected is a cargo that does not reach Iranian buyers, an oil shipment that does not generate Iranian revenue, a transaction that does not fund the IRG's operational budget or its salary payment system or its proxy network financing. Iranian state media reported that a deal could see the lifting of oil sanctions and the end to the U.S. blockade of its ports, with a return to pre-war levels of shipping in the Strait of Hormuz within 30 days. Pre-war levels within 30 days. That is what Iran's state media is describing as the Phase 1 outcome. The blockade lifts, the oil sanctions lift, Iranian crude flows again to Chinese buyers at whatever price the post-war market establishes, the $500 million daily loss stops, the frozen assets begin unfreezing, and the IRG's war chest, which has been depleted at $500 million per day for 87 days by the blockade's direct economic impact, begins recovering from the revenue stream that Phase 1's implementation restores. Time is on our side means the opposite of that. For every additional day the blockade operates before Phase 2's nuclear requirements are documented, verified, and committed to in a form that the blockade's continued enforcement could otherwise produce. Time is on our side is the strategic communication that the blockade's 100-ship milestone makes credible and that the deal's Phase 2 architecture's structural vulnerability makes necessary as a negotiating posture rather than as a completion signal. Now let's talk about the Pompeo formulation, because pay the IRG to build a WMD program and terrorize the world is not simply a political attack from a former official who has fallen out with the president he once served. It is the precise structural description of what the two-phase MOO architecture produces if Phase 2 fails, and Phase 2's failure probability, given the IRG's institutional logic and the specific history of every previous negotiating track this conflict has produced, is the specific risk that every Republican hawk statement this weekend was designed to make part of the public record before the document achieves the signed status that the largely negotiated language implied was imminent. The IRG's institutional survival depends on maintaining the nuclear stockpile as its ultimate deterrent. A 60-day negotiation period would be set for discussions on the nuclear issue, Iran's semi-official Tasnim news agency reported, 60 days, during which the blockade has been lifted, the frozen assets have been unfreezing. The oil sanctions have been relaxing, and Iranian crude has been flowing again to the buyers whose purchases fund the war chest that pays the IRG soldiers and regional commanders and proxy network financing. The IRG that enters Phase 2's nuclear negotiations 60 days after Phase 1's implementation is not the IRG that was losing $500 million per day when the largely negotiated language was produced. It is an IRG whose economic recovery from Phase 1 has been partially funded by the concessions the deal delivered before the nuclear requirement was addressed. Pompeo's formulation is the compressed version of that structural analysis, pay the IRG. Is Phase 1's concessions to build a WMD program is the nuclear stockpile that Phase 2 fails to address because the leverage that produced Phase 1's concessions has been surrendered by Phase 1's implementation, and terrorize the world is the regional power projection that an economically recovered IRG with an intact nuclear program conducts in the post-deal environment that Phase 2's failure produces. Trump in his own statement on Sunday did not refer to the criticism but said any deal he signed off on would be nothing like the Obama deal, which he described as weak. Not so with the transaction currently being negotiated with Iran by the Trump administration, the exact opposite in fact. The exact opposite is Trump's public commitment that the deal he signs will not reproduce the structural failure that the Obama deal produced. The Obama deal lifted sanctions, unfroze assets, and addressed the nuclear question simultaneously in a single document that both sides signed at the same moment. Its failure, from the Trump administration's perspective, was that it provided economic relief before the nuclear requirement was permanently resolved, allowing Iran to recover economically while maintaining enrichment capability that could be reconstituted after the deal's expiration. The exact opposite means the deal Trump signs will not provide economic relief before the nuclear requirement is permanently resolved, which means either Phase 2 resolves the nuclear question before the blockade lifts or the blockade stays until it does, which means time is on our side is not patience management. It is the public statement of the specific sequencing requirement that distinguishes the transaction Trump is describing from the deal Obama signed. Now let's be precise about what the Iranian side's Sunday communications tell you about the institutional distance between where the MOO's text is and where the exact opposite requires it to go, because Iranian state media and semi-official outlets produced three distinct communications on Sunday that collectively described the Iranian institutional position with more precision than any diplomatic formulation captures. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian said his country was ready to assure the world that it is not seeking nuclear weapons, according to state media, ready to assure, not ready to dismantle, not ready to transfer, not ready to allow the removal of 440 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium from Iranian territory, ready to assure. The specific verb choice is the institutional limit of what the civilian presidential apparatus has been authorized to communicate about the nuclear question. Assurance is a statement. Assurance is words on a document or a diplomatic communique. Assurance is not the physical removal of weapons-grade adjacent material from the territory of the organization whose institutional survival depends on maintaining it. Pezeshkian can provide assurances. He cannot authorize dismantlement. That authorization lives in the command structure that has not appeared in public since February. 8th, Iran's Fars news agency said the deal would allow the regime to manage the Strait of Hormuz, manage, not relinquish, not open under international maritime law, manage, the same formulation that the IRG's institutional voice has used every time the Hormuz question has been the specific item whose language was under negotiation. The gap between manage and the unconditional unrestricted toll-free freedom of navigation that Starmer and von der Leyen described as the minimum acceptable outcome for the international community is not a drafting gap, it is the institutional gap between what the IRG's survival calculation can authorize and what Washington and its allies require. Rubio repeated Trump's criteria for a deal, including stopping Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, reopening the Strait of Hormuz without tolls, and turning over enriched uranium. This problem will be solved, as the president's made clear, one way or the other. Rubio said, one way or the other. That phrase has appeared in Rubio's public statements about this conflict's resolution at every phase transition point where the diplomatic track has produced insufficient movement toward the specific outcome Washington requires. One way means the deal. The other way means what the deal was designed to avoid, and Rubio saying one way or the other on the same day Trump said time is on our side is the dual-channel communication of a negotiating posture that is simultaneously patient enough to wait for the right deal and explicit enough that the blockade stays until the deal is reached, certified, and signed. Here is the honest assessment of where this conflict stands on May 25, 2026. The 87th day of a war that has redirected 100 ships, cost Iran more than $40 billion in direct conflict and blockade losses, and produced a largely negotiated move whose nuclear architecture has generated enough Republican institutional opposition to require the president to tell his own negotiating team not to rush. In a Public Truth social post, the blockade hit 100 ships. Trump said time is on our side. The MOU's Phase 2 architecture defers the nuclear question to a 60-day window that operates after the blockade's leverage has been surrendered. Republicans called it paying the IRG. The White House told them to shut their stupid mouths. Netanyahu posted his condition. Pezeshkian offered to assure but not to dismantle. Tasnim said 60 days for nuclear talks. Fars said manage. Rubio said one way or the other. The U.S. blockade has now hit the century mark. There have been 100 commercial ships either entering or leaving Iranian ports redirected by the blockade, 100 ships in 6 weeks is the operational record of a pressure campaign that Admiral Brad Cooper described as having squeezed Iran economically. Squeezed is not broken. Squeezed is the condition that produces the largely negotiated language and the time is on our side response in the same 24-hour window. Squeezed means the pressure is sufficient to bring Iran to the negotiating room but not yet sufficient to produce the institutional authorization of the nuclear concession that Washington requires before the blockade that is producing the squeeze is certified and signed away. Time is on our side is the operational description of the specific asymmetry that 100 ships and $500 million daily losses have created between the two sides' endurance calculations. Iran's oil storage is at overflow. Its economic deterioration is compounding at a rate that Iranian officials have been quantifying in statements to international media. Its civilian government is ready to assure its IRG command structure is ready to manage the strait, while its Fars news agency describes the deal's Hormuz architecture in terms that contradict the toll-free unconditional freedom of navigation that Washington and its allies require. And Washington's blockade has 100 ships redirected, 2 carrier strike groups operational, the very major attack on postponed but not cancelled status, and a president who has told his negotiating team that there can be no mistakes and that the blockade stays until an agreement is reached, certified, and signed. The exact opposite of the Obama deal means the nuclear question is not deferred until after the economic relief has been delivered. It means the specific sequencing that time is on our side enables the continuation of the blockade squeeze until the Iranian institutional authorization that produces dismantle and remove rather than assure and manage has been produced by the pressure that 100 ships and 6 weeks of $500 million daily losses have been building toward. Watch whether the MOU's architecture changes before signature to reflect the exact opposite sequencing that Trump described on Sunday, or maintains the Phase 1 economic relief before Phase 2 nuclear Requirement structure that Pompeo characterized as paying the IRG. Watch whether Rubio's one way or the other produces the good news he suggested was possible on Sunday before the time is on our side post shifted the timeline. Watch whether the 100-ship milestone produces the specific Iranian institutional movement that the 50-ship milestone and the 75-ship milestone did not, and watch whether time is on our side remains the operative American posture when the Iranian oil storage overflow threshold that an Iranian oil ministry official told the New York Times is 40 days from complete exhaustion produces the specific economic crisis that the blockades. 100 ships have been building toward 100 ships, 6 weeks, $500 million per day. Time is on our side, the blockade stays until reached, certified, and signed, and the IRG, whose nuclear stockpile survived 100 redirected ships and 6 weeks of squeeze, is making the specific institutional calculation about whether the pressure that produced time is on our side will eventually reach the level that produces dismantle and remove from the command structure that has produced assure and manage for every previous diplomatic window this conflict has opened. The 100-ship milestone is not the end of the blockade, it is the specific operational marker that makes time is on our side analytically credible rather than rhetorically convenient. The ships that get redirected after ship 100 are the ships that make ship 150 and ship 200 the milestones that produce the institutional authorization that 100 has not yet produced. Stay informed, stay ahead.